Beneath the crowns and corsets, behind the velvet curtains of palaces, lived women who didn't whisper. They roared. This isn't the fairy tale version of royalty. These were queens, princesses, and duchesses who scorched reputations, shattered etiquette, and made courtiers cry before breakfast. From icy one-liners to full-throttle tirades, these royal women didn't play nice. They played to win. And history, try as it might, couldn't silence them. These are the 25 most foul-mouthed, sharp-tongued, and gloriously rude women ever to wear a crown, or throw one. Welcome to the royal court you were never supposed to see. Before we dive headfirst into centuries of royal mayhem, make sure you subscribe, especially if you enjoy history served with sarcasm and a side of scandal. While you're here, drop a comment below. Where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Midnight in Manchester? 3 a.m. in Texas? We want to know who else is up late digging through the royal archives of rage. 1. Queen Victoria. She did not suffer fools. She did not particularly suffer friends. Queen Victoria, that plump icon of prudery and national mourning, might be the last person you'd expect to unleash blistering rants behind palace walls. But make no mistake, under the widow's weeds and sentimental statues, there beat the heart of a woman with the emotional subtlety of a cannon. Victoria wasn't merely blunt. She was a scalpel dipped in salt water, sharp, surgical, and guaranteed to sting. Her letters are filled with venom wrapped in curlicue script, often addressing those nearest to her with the tenderness of a military tribunal. She once referred to her own children as frog-faced, tiresome, or impossible, sometimes all in the same breath. Lord Melbourne, her mentor, earned her devotion, but even he was once told he was positively wearisome. Her own husband, Prince Albert, found himself on the receiving end of multiple handwritten tirades that would make a German general sweat. When Victoria disapproved of someone, which was frequent, fast, and often final, she did not whisper it behind a fan. She wrote it down in great detail and ensured it reached the appropriate recipient. A diplomat once described being reduced to shivering after receiving a letter from Her Majesty correcting the tone of his last dispatch. He'd gotten the message. No one misrepresented Victoria and walked away with their dignity intact. She had a favorite phrase, "We are not amused." But the real shock is how rarely she actually said it. The truth was worse. When Victoria wasn't amused, she didn't say so politely. She eviscerated. Her outbursts toward her staff were legendary. One footman who clumsily spilled tea was told he was a disgrace to livery. Another was banished from Windsor Castle entirely after failing to warm her gloves. Warming gloves, as it turns out, was not just a task. It was a moral test. One you failed at your peril. Ministers who annoyed her, and there were many, were labeled imbeciles, dangerous meddlers, or men who should never have been born. Gladstone, despite decades of service, she deemed a half-mad fanatic. Her nickname for Disraeli was marginally warmer. That flattering man. She didn't trust flattery, but she tolerated it. Barely. Victoria's private journals read like the world's frostiest burn book. When a lady-in-waiting cried at the news of her fiancé's death, the Queen scribbled, "Unfortunate. But really, one must not lose control in public." There is no known record of Victoria attending a therapy session, but if she had, the therapist might not have survived. And it wasn't just the powerful who bore the brunt of her icy disdain. Her own daughter, Vicky, later Empress of Germany, spent her life being belittled by her mother in stern, condescending letters that treated feelings like a contagious disease. When her son Bertie was caught in yet another scandal, Victoria called him frivolous, idle, and utterly without a sense of duty, and that was one of her gentler assessments. Yet somehow she was loved, or at least respected, because Victoria's insults didn't come from nothing. They came from certainty, from the rock-solid, unshakable belief that she alone held the line between moral order and chaos. She scolded Britain the way a lioness scolds her cubs, loudly, often, and with the firm conviction that she was right. And in her mind, She usually was. But her verbal cruelties weren't always strategic. Sometimes they were petty, personal, and plain vicious. She mocked female politicians as unwomanly and shrill. She dismissed social reformers as distasteful meddlers. And when Florence Nightingale became a national hero, Victoria privately called her tiresome and overstepping. That was her version of applause. Still, there's something weirdly admirable about a queen who never pretended to be nice. Victoria didn't play court games. She didn't flatter. She ruled. And in ruling, she scolded. Her court was not a playground. It was a disciplinarian's drawing room, scented with lavender water and the unmistakable aroma of fear. Toward the end of her life, her tongue softened, but only slightly. She'd grown too old to scold as frequently, though the desire never seemed to wane. On her deathbed, her final words weren't known to be affectionate. Some say she murmured for Turi, her favorite servant. Others claim she just sighed and dismissed the day as beastly tiring. And maybe that was the truest Victoriaism of all. Empires may crumble, loved ones may gather, but for God's sake, someone bring her warm gloves and a bit of silence. She left behind a continent trembling under her descendants, a dynasty of queens and empresses, and at least 3 generations of politicians still waking up in cold sweats from the memory of her gaze. And as Britain buried its longest reigning monarch at the time, one can only imagine the whispered relief from the staff corridors of Windsor. The Empress of Snubs had finally clocked out. But if Victoria was a storm in widow's weeds, the next woman was a hurricane in pearls and fire. Because when Queen Elizabeth I got angry, people didn't just flinch. They prayed. 2. Queen Elizabeth I. Elizabeth I did not simply speak. She detonated. Her words were weapons, barbed, polished, and launched with a theatrical precision that made seasoned diplomats reconsider their career choices. If Queen Victoria scolded like a strict matron, Elizabeth lashed like a divine thunderbolt, bright enough to illuminate your faults and hot enough to leave the court roasted for days. And the extraordinary part? She did it all with the composure of a woman threading a needle. Foreign ambassadors wrote home with trembling admiration. They came expecting a cautious monarch. They left having endured something closer to an intellectual mugging. Her Majesty, one ambassador confessed, spoke with such heat that I feared the very tapestries might smolder. The tapestries, fortunately, survived. His self-esteem, less so. Elizabeth's temper was not random chaos. It was performance, controlled fury, tailored to authority. She could pivot from charming court hostess to volcanic critic in a heartbeat. To be summoned before her during a bad hour was to stand at the edge of a cliff while she calmly explained the geological instability beneath your feet. Counselors learned early that disagreeing with her was dangerous territory. She once called William Cecil, her closest advisor, a most pestilent fellow, and a moment later assured him, "You know I love you." This was Elizabeth's emotional style. Insult first, affection later, and God help you if you misinterpreted the order. Her vocabulary of contempt was legendary. False knaves, malapert fools, drowsy-headed sluggards, all were standard-issue Elizabethan reprimands, deployed with force, style, and perfect enunciation. And though history tends to paint her as the Virgin Queen floating ethereally above worldly pettiness, the reality was that she could, and did, verbally body-slam anyone who tested her patience. Ladies-in-waiting often bore the brunt. They were expected to anticipate her moods, predict her needs, and occasionally survive her outrage. A misplaced jewel, a late dressing, or a clumsily delivered message could trigger a tirade. Elizabeth didn't necessarily hate them. She just had very little interest in pretending to be pleasant. Foreign queens suffered too. When Mary, Queen of Scots, pressed her for succession promises, Elizabeth's letters snapped with icy, elegant contempt. She wrote with the tone of a woman who could maintain diplomacy but refused to hide her irritation. Her sharpest barbs were dipped not in rage but in reason, which somehow made them sting worse. But perhaps the most spectacular eruptions came during discussions of marriage. Whenever Parliament urged her to wed, she delivered blistering speeches that turned the entire assembly into chastened schoolboys. One unforgettable address ended with her declaring she needed no master, followed by a glare so harrowing that the room apparently fell silent. Imagine being publicly scolded by a monarch who could dismantle your moral fiber in 3 sentences or fewer. Still, her anger wasn't always destructive. Strange as it sounds, Elizabeth's sharp tongue was a diplomatic tool, a pressure valve, and occasionally a shield. She used anger the way a conductor uses a baton, directing attention, setting tempo, reminding the orchestra who leads. Her scolding wasn't random cruelty, but a method of governance wrapped in theater. However, that didn't make it feel any better to the people standing in front of her. One courtier reported that when she caught him whispering during a council session, she stared him down and said, "If your tongue were as swift at duty as at gossip, England should prosper twice over." The man reportedly froze so completely the council worried he had fainted with his eyes open. Elizabeth's temper also veered into petty territory. She loved compliments but despised overstepping. She adored dancing but snapped if anyone suggested she might be too old for it. She enjoyed gifts but interrogated the giver if she suspected political strings. Age, vanity, and insecurity all lived beneath the crown, and they occasionally slipped out as fury. But the sharpness was part of her mystique. Court poets praised her brilliance. Ambassadors feared her storms. Scholars admired her mind. And yet all of them, at some point, were scorched by her words. She ruled not by sweetness, but by sheer rhetorical gravity. Nobody forgot a conversation with Elizabeth, not because it was pleasant, but because survival required full mental armor. And despite it all, people adored her. They adored the force, the fire, the refusal to shrink. Her temper might reduce a room to ashes, but her leadership built an era. Her insults, ironically, became part of her charm. To be scolded by Elizabeth was almost an honor, a sign that the Queen had bothered to notice you and decided you needed correction. But if Elizabeth's fury was a theatrical inferno, the next royal on our list carried her anger like a smoldering ember, hidden until the moment it singed everything around her. For when Queen Anne lost her patience, the explosion wasn't loud. It was personal. If you're enjoying the royal drama so far, don't forget to subscribe, because trust me, Queen Elizabeth Wuss is just the warm-up act. While you're at it, drop a comment. Where are you tuning in from, and what time is it on your end? Are you watching this in the dead of night like a proper history gremlin, or sneaking it in on your lunch break? We see you. 3. Queen Anne. Queen Anne did not radiate the theatrical fire of Elizabeth I, nor the frosty imperial disdain of Victoria. No, Anne's temper was a quieter storm, the kind that settles low and heavy over a city before anyone realizes the lightning is already inside the walls. Her rudeness wasn't flamboyant. It was domestic, intimate, the sort of cutting irritation that could sour a room faster than curdled milk, leaving courtiers looking at one another as if someone had tracked in mud. Anne lived in a body that betrayed her often. Illness, grief, and chronic pain shaped her world into a narrow corridor of tolerance. But that did not make her gentle. Quite the opposite. Frustration sharpened her like a whetstone, and the slightest inconvenience could turn her day, and her household, into a battlefield fought with sighs, snapped orders, and the royal equivalent of slamming a door. Her ladies-in-waiting, poor souls, endured the worst of it. They were expected to hover around her like solicitous moths, anticipating needs that Anne herself didn't always recognize until they were unmet, at which point the Queen would erupt in a curt, scalding dismissal. A misplaced shawl? A button pulled too tight? A suggestion offered too eagerly? Any of these could earn a glare so withering it felt like the face of God had turned away from you personally. Anne could silence an entire room simply by frowning in disappointment. She didn't shout often, but when she did, It carried the weight of 12 unspoken arguments that she'd been saving for future use. Chronic gout made her short-tempered, and courtiers learned to identify a gout day by the way she gripped her chair arms, white-knuckled, tight-lipped, capable of barking at anyone who dared comment on the weather, the lighting, or the unfortunate state of her stockings. If Queen Victoria weaponized letters, and Elizabeth weaponized rhetoric, Queen Anne weaponized tone. A single "indeed" from her could mean, "You've failed me? You're dismissed. How dare you?" Or, "Why are you still standing here breathing my air?" Her ability to compress layered contempt into one syllable was practically alchemical. And then there was her relationship with Sarah Churchill, political operator, confidant, emotional fire starter. Their friendship, rivalry, and eventual blow-up was an opera of whispered insults, slammed carriage doors, and resentful letters. Sarah was famously blunt. Anne could be stubborn to the point of paralysis. Together, they produced some of history's most spectacularly tense arguments, conducted through folded arms, clipped phrases, and polite phrases, delivered like arrows. One infamous moment. Sarah once suggested Anne spend less time with her new favorite, Abigail Masham. Anne's response was so stiff, so cold, so laced with barely contained outrage, that Sarah later admitted she momentarily thought the Queen might have her removed from the room by force. Instead, Anne simply turned away and refused to acknowledge her for the rest of the day, a punishment worse than shouting, because it invited everyone present to watch Sarah disintegrate under the weight of royal silence. Anne's rudeness was rarely dramatic, but always memorable. Even diplomats noted it. A French envoy wrote that speaking with her was like walking barefoot over scattered pins. One does not know where the next sharpness lies. Yet he also noted that she was unfailingly polite when things ran smoothly. The key problem? Things rarely ran smoothly for Queen Anne. Her staff learned to fear mornings most of all. The Queen often woke irritable, exhausted, and already mid-argument with the universe. Some days she scolded her chambermaids for letting in too much sunlight. Other days she scolded them for not letting in enough. The correct amount of light was a mystical figure known only to Anne and revealed exclusively in hindsight. Even her famous appetite, a source of whispered court gossip, fed into her sharp tongue. Meals that arrived late, cold, or with one too many capers were greeted with curt reproach. Cooks trembled. Stewards prayed. And heaven help the server who dropped so much as a spoon. Yet beneath the impatience, Anne had a fragile seriousness that made her rudeness oddly human. Her anger was not arrogance. It was weariness. Her harshness masked vulnerability that she never knew how to articulate. She was a queen who desperately wanted peace and instead was handed pain, politics, and a nation that expected more of her than she could ever comfortably give. Still, her temper carved deep marks into her legacy. Courtiers remembered her terse remarks. Servants remembered her sighs of exasperation. Ministers remembered how her voice tightened when they pushed her too far. And anyone who ever tried to maneuver her into a decision she didn't like remembered the glacial, immovable silence that could freeze a conversation and a career mid-sentence. But as formidable as Anne's quiet fury could be, the next royal wielded her temper like a torch swung through a warehouse full of gunpowder. Because Queen Mary I, unlike Anne, didn't simmer. She ignited. 4. Queen Mary I, Bloody Mary. She was England's first crowned queen regnant, and she ruled with the warmth of an iron fireplace. Queen Mary I, the daughter of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon, has been saddled by history with a moniker that sticks like wet ash. Bloody Mary. But beneath the ominous nickname and the grim iconography, Mary's temper was not merely notorious for what it allegedly caused. It was remarkable for how precisely, even coldly, it landed, like a judgment you couldn't escape, and frankly, weren't meant to. Mary did not explode often. She didn't need to. Her version of anger was colder than fury and far more dangerous. A steady stream of reproach, pronounced with the moral certainty of someone convinced she'd been appointed by divine right and had been personally insulted by your incompetence. Contemporaries who stood too close to her displeasure often described it with a sort of hushed dread. She didn't scream, she didn't throw things, but her voice could turn suddenly flat, her eyes narrowing, her shoulders stiffening just so. Then the verdict would fall, calm, cutting, and absolutely final. Courtiers quickly learned to fear that silence, the kind that stretches out like a blade being drawn slowly from its sheath. The nobles and counselors who served under Mary faced a monarch whose personal disappointments were rarely kept private. If a minister failed her, she said so directly. If a lady-in-waiting arrived late or sloppily dressed, the rebuke could be heard echoing down the corridor. One foreign ambassador described a breakfast where Mary dressed down her household in full view of the guests, correcting table manners, late arrivals, and an allegedly indecent amount of smiling. Behind closed doors, it was worse. Letters from her reign mention episodes where she berated servants in front of others for missteps so minor they barely qualified as events. But Mary viewed such failures not as practical errors, but as moral ones. And a moral failure to her was not a learning opportunity. It was a defect. To disappoint Mary Tudor was to be judged unworthy of the task, and often unworthy of the Queen herself. Her scoldings were often made sharper by her unrelenting religious conviction. Mary viewed her rule not just as political, but spiritual. As such, opposition didn't just make her frustrated, it made her righteously indignant. Her verbal lashings frequently borrowed from sermons. To disobey her was to err against not just the crown, but the church. That kind of anger doesn't come with volume, it comes with gravity. Even her closest advisors felt the sting. Simon Renard, the imperial ambassador who had more access to Mary than nearly anyone, once confided in his letters that Mary's moods turned on a pin, and that a single disagreement may ice the day. He tread carefully, often diplomatically agreeing with her in person before sending separate advice in writing, where at least her fury couldn't stare him down in real time. Her husband, Philip of Spain, fared no better. Mary adored him. He tolerated her. Their marriage was cold, awkward, and politically expedient. Mary's temper, when it came to Philip, often turned inward, stewing into resentment, bitterness, and long tirades against those she blamed for keeping him away. Ministers reported being summoned late at night to hear complaints about Philip's neglect, his absences, and the conspiracies she believed swirled around them. And yet, for all her intensity, Mary was not devoid of warmth. Those few she trusted, very few, described her as deeply loyal, even gentle in private moments. But the distance between those rare instances and the wrath she directed toward enemies, or staff, was vast. It created a whiplash effect for those within her circle. You were either within the circle of grace or completely outside of it, and she could shift your membership without warning. Even illness didn't soften her. Toward the end of her short reign, Mary became more physically frail, but her tongue retained its edge. One court physician reportedly muttered something under his breath during a consultation and was promptly told by the Queen that mumbling is the defense of liars. It was the last time he failed to speak clearly in her presence. Mary's reign ended in disappointment, illness, and the slow crumbling of her political hopes. But the fear she instilled lasted far longer. Those who served her remembered the sudden silences, the public humiliations, the glare that could chill a room, and the heavy sense that you were always one mistake away from judgment. But if Mary's wrath came from divine conviction and personal betrayal, the next royal made rudeness a domestic sport. Because Margaret Beaufort, matriarch of the Tudors, didn't need a throne to make you feel insignificant. She just needed a hallway, a stair, and a few choice words that would ruin your entire afternoon. 5. Margaret Beaufort. If ever there were a woman who could control a dynasty with one raised eyebrow and a disapproving murmur, it was Margaret Beaufort. She didn't shout, she didn't storm, she didn't need to. Her words were fewer, quieter, and always sharpened to a point. Imagine a Tudor grandmother with the emotional temperature of a cathedral in winter and the authority of a tax audit. That was Margaret. Mother of Henry VII, grandmother to Henry VIII, and architect of the entire Tudor rise to power, Margaret Beaufort existed at the core of England's bloodiest political pivot. But don't let the rosary beads and pious reputation fool you. Behind the layers of religious devotion and maternal dignity was a woman who, by most accounts, could reduce a nobleman to silence with a single sentence, and regularly did. She didn't tolerate rudeness from others, of course, but she had a curious way of redefining her own cutting remarks as clarity. By the time she reached middle age, Margaret had mastered the art of weaponized propriety. Courtiers and family members alike reported that she could deliver a reprimand so politely phrased, it took you several hours to realize you'd just been publicly scolded in front of a tapestry. But her worst target, as history has quietly whispered, may have been her daughter-in-law, Elizabeth of York. By all appearances, their relationship was civil. Behind the scenes, a daily chess match between a tired queen and a mother-in-law who never quite accepted that someone else was allowed to parent the royal children. Margaret treated the new queen less like an equal and more like an incompetent nanny whose supervision needed correction. Reports from court suggest Margaret involved herself in nearly every domestic and ceremonial decision. From the swaddling of baby Arthur to the composition of royal menus, she had an opinion, and, worse, a system. Servants were instructed to follow Lady Margaret's method, and those who deviated discovered exactly how much scorn a holy matron could compress into a single sideways glance. Despite never claiming the title of queen, she insisted on being treated with royal dignity. She signed documents with queenly stylings. She demanded ceremonial precedence over almost everyone at court, up to and including the actual queen. Protocols had to be rewritten to accommodate her hybrid status. Not quite monarch, but absolutely not a mere noblewoman, and woe betide the person who addressed her incorrectly. One hapless court official once failed to call her My Lady the King's mother, and was met with a chilly silence that stretched into several long, awkward minutes before she finally said, "I see I am to be corrected by men with short memories." That was the style. She didn't insult people outright. She reminded them, with a sweet and terrifying smile, of what they had forgotten, and what they owed her. Margaret also maintained a household of near-military discipline. Her personal staff worked under strict codes of conduct, many of them recorded in writing. Silence during meals, swift obedience, letters written in formal hand. One clerk who wrote to her in a too familiar tone was reassigned to a different estate before his ink had dried. To work for Margaret Beaufort was to enter a lifelong etiquette exam with daily grading. And yet, despite the heavy-handed management, she was respected, sometimes even admired, because beneath the iron discipline was genuine competence. She organized estates with breathtaking efficiency. She funded educational institutions. She handled political negotiations with absolute precision. People obeyed her not just out of fear, but because, inconveniently, she was often right. Her rudeness stung, yes, but it usually came attached to the cold slap of accuracy. What made Margaret's sharp tongue so potent wasn't just its delivery, it was the moral weight behind it. She believed in what she said. She believed in her role. She believed in the rightness of the Tudor cause, and that belief made her unbearable to defy. Her contempt wasn't emotional. It was structured, calculated, judicial, and while many of her descendants would inherit her ambition, few would master the elegant cruelty of her disapproval. Her words didn't echo. They stuck, like burrs on a velvet cloak, like judgment dressed in velvet. But if Margaret Beaufort was the queen mother of formalized frost, the next royal threw away the script altogether. Empress Matilda, also known as Maud, didn't care for etiquette, optics, or tact. She believed she was right, and God help the noble who tried to tell her otherwise. 6. Empress Matilda. Maud. History remembers her as a would-be queen, a Civil War instigator, and the mother of the Plantagenet line. But before all that, before the sieges, the failed coronation, the endless war against Stephen, Empress Matilda was known for something far more immediate: her temper. Chroniclers didn't mince words. They called her imperious, arrogant, and unbearable in her pride. And for once, the medieval writers might have actually undersold it. Matilda didn't just expect to be obeyed, she demanded it. Loudly, publicly, often. And with such scathing authority that even her allies sometimes had to take a breath and reconsider their loyalties. Her tongue was as sharp as her claim to the throne, and just as inflexible. When she entered a hall, the temperature dropped. When she opened her mouth, it plummeted further. She was born to rule, or at least she was born certain of it. The daughter of Henry I, raised in imperial courts across Europe, Matilda had been Empress of the Holy Roman Empire before returning to England. That alone gave her a pedigree unmatched by any rival. But the court she returned to wasn't interested in pedigrees, it was interested in power. And Matilda, unfortunately for everyone, brought both. What made her rudeness legendary wasn't just the volume or vocabulary, it was the precision. She didn't lash out without aim. She identified a weakness in her opponent, usually some insecurity about their status, their lineage, or their military competence, and then casually dismantled it in public, with the tone of a woman explaining the weather. One noble who tried to delay her progress through his lands was told he had the courage of a fox and the wit of a cowherd. She said it at dinner, with his wife present, while accepting his wine. Even her allies were not safe. When her most loyal supporter, Robert of Gloucester, questioned one of her siege strategies, she interrupted him mid-sentence and said, "The empire was not won by such hesitation." The empire in question, of course, had not actually been won at all, but Matilda's grip on reality was occasionally secondary to her sense of theatrical timing. It wasn't all insults and icy silences, though. Sometimes it was cold efficiency. When she took the city of London during her brief moment of near victory in 1141, she entered the capital not as a diplomat, but as a monarch already crowned in her own mind. She refused to court the city's leaders, refused to flatter, and reportedly demanded taxes with such brusque authority that the citizens began plotting her expulsion almost immediately. One observer wrote that she treated all with a contempt most unseemly for a lady, a very medieval way of saying she was spectacularly rude to every man who thought he deserved her charm. And then there was the famous coronation that wasn't. Having captured King Stephen and cleared the way for her crowning, Matilda managed to alienate nearly every noble in the room with her cold demeanor and impossible demands. According to one chronicler, the moment she opened her mouth to speak to the assembled lords, the air in the room became heavy with resentment. Within days, the coronation collapsed under the weight of her own disdain. Still, Matilda never doubted herself. Her sharpness wasn't performative, it was her worldview. She genuinely believed that being right and being born to rule was reason enough to be obeyed. And if the men around her didn't like it, well, that was their weakness. She didn't lower herself to make others comfortable. She didn't soften. She didn't charm. She commanded. And yet, for all her brilliance and brutal clarity, Matilda's story is defined by near misses. A throne just out of reach, a coronation that vanished, a war that ground on longer than her patience. The fire she brought to every encounter, every council, every letter, every clash, left its mark on history, but not the crown. Still, her legacy endured, not in gentle memory, but in her son, Henry II, who inherited not only the throne she never got, but a trace of her volcanic arrogance. And yet, Matilda's fury was not born of ambition alone. It was born of a world that told her to wait, to yield, to smile. And she refused. But while Matilda burned her way through diplomacy, the next royal chose her battles differently. Queen Isabella of France didn't need to raise her voice. She could silence a room with nothing more than a sneer and destroy reputations before the second course was served. 7. Queen Isabella of France. They called her the she-wolf of France, not for her elegance, which was considerable, nor for her beauty, which was undisputed, but for her cold-blooded precision, and the way her fury always arrived dressed in silk, carrying a blade of words sharper than anything forged in steel. Queen Isabella of France didn't scream, and she rarely made a scene. She didn't have to. Her rudeness came with court polish, ceremonial formality, and a ruthless clarity that made even her allies speak in hushed tones when she passed by. Born a French princess, married into the chaos of Edward II's England, Isabella arrived at the English court armed with royal blood, cultivated spite, and a growing list of grievances. Her new husband had little interest in her, emotionally, politically, or otherwise. Instead, Edward lavished his attention on his male favorites, granting them titles, wealth, and court access that should have been Isabella's. She did not take this lightly. Diplomatic letters from the time report that Isabella spoke with contempt thinly veiled, especially toward the king's companions. She was known to interrupt conversations with abrupt questions designed to shame her target, or to suddenly excuse herself mid-sentence as if the person speaking wasn't worth finishing a conversation with. Her courtiers called it the French frost. Her enemies called it something worse. One of her more infamous habits was correcting nobles in public, names, titles, protocol, even pronunciation. She once corrected a bishop's Latin during a blessing, prompting him to go pale and lose his place in the sermon. A chronicler noted that the queen smiled like one who had just witnessed something distasteful and would now be taking her leave forever. Her disdain for Edward's inner circle, especially Piers Gaveston and later Hugh Despenser, was not only open but lethal to their reputations. In court she referred to them with mocking diminutives, and during ceremonies she made a habit of turning her back when they entered the room. At one feast she allegedly asked aloud, within earshot of the entire court, "Must we share every meal with such parasites?" Edward ignored her, but the court didn't. Every fork paused, every eye turned. But Isabella's sharpness wasn't all interpersonal. She was a diplomat in her own right, and had little patience for male counselors who assumed otherwise. She once scolded an ambassador from Aragon who dared speak over her, pausing only long enough to say, "If you speak to me as to a servant, you shall be answered as by a sovereign." The man reportedly bowed so low upon leaving the chamber that he backed into a tapestry and tangled himself in it. Her rudeness was, in many ways, her armor. The English court expected pliancy in its queens, decorum, sweetness, and preferably silence. Isabella offered none. She was elegant, yes, and impeccably dressed, but the smile was calculated. The charm was conditional. Her temper didn't explode, it calcified. She could humiliate a baron without raising her voice. She could command a room without standing. After years of being sidelined, Isabella eventually reached her limit. She left England under the pretense of diplomacy and returned with an army, and her lover, Roger Mortimer, at her side. But long before the swords were drawn, she had already dismantled Edward II's court with her tongue. Her return was a coup in every sense, but it wasn't sudden. It had been building for years in the way she looked at people, in the words she chose not to say, and in the devastating silence that followed those she did. Even after Edward was removed from the throne, Isabella didn't soften. As Queen Mother to Edward III, she maintained a powerful presence at court, often weighing in on decisions and occasionally silencing young nobles with a glance. One courtier described her as a woman whose approval came colder than her wrath. In Isabella's world, praise was rare and patience was conditional. Misstep once, and you would find yourself locked out, not by royal decree, but by the absence of her acknowledgement. And in a court that revolved around proximity to power, that kind of exile was worse than open punishment. Yet, for all her calculated contempt, Isabella was admired for her intelligence and feared for her resolve. Her rudeness wasn't insecurity, it was strategy. A life built on being overlooked by her husband had trained her to never, ever be overlooked again. But while Isabella's anger was delivered like poison in a goblet of wine, the next royal brought a subtler flavor of frustration. Anne of Cleves, fourth wife of Henry VIII, may not have started out with a sharp tongue, but give her a bad marriage, a strange land, and enough Tudor politics, and even she couldn't keep her irritation entirely under wraps. 8. Anne of Cleves. In the long, blood-stained scroll of Henry VIII's wives, Anne of Cleves often appears as a footnote, a diplomatic pawn, a brief marriage, a quick annulment. She's remembered, when remembered at all, as the one who got away with her head still attached. But beneath the historical shrug is a far more interesting figure. A foreign princess, dropped into a venomous Tudor court, surrounded by spies, rivals, and the most temperamental monarch in Europe. And eventually, inevitably, Anne of Cleves got tired of pretending to smile. When she arrived in England in 1539, Anne was already at a disadvantage. She spoke almost no English. She didn't know the customs. She didn't understand the stiff theater of Henry's court. Worse still, she didn't look the way he wanted her to look. The famously unflattering phrase, "I like her not," was Henry's first public review. It set the tone. The marriage lasted 6 months. But the irritation Anne developed toward English manners and the people enforcing them lasted considerably longer. While early reports describe her as gentle, even shy, letters from her own household suggest a growing frustration that hardened into sarcasm. The longer she lived in England, the more she began to critique it. Quietly at first, then less quietly. According to several attendants, Anne frequently complained, sometimes in German, sometimes in slow, annoyed English, about the stiffness of court rituals, the prissiness of English fashion, and the food, which she reportedly described as a tragedy served warm. When a lady-in-waiting tried to correct her table manners during a feast, Anne is said to have replied, "In Cleves we do not insult our guests between courses." The room went silent. The message was clear. After the annulment, she was awarded a generous settlement, several estates, and a title, the King's Sister. This was meant to be an honor. Anne took it as a half-hearted consolation prize. In private, she referred to it as a crown made of paper. She didn't seek confrontation, but neither did she make much effort to hide her boredom, her disappointment, or her evolving disdain for the courtiers assigned to cheer her. Visitors to her household described her demeanor as pleasant but guarded, and noted that she had developed a habit of sighing theatrically when anyone mentioned the royal court. Her steward once remarked that she had taken to mocking the endless rituals of English noblewomen, mimicking their delicate hand gestures and fake laughter for the amusement of her inner circle. One guest reportedly found this performance so accurate and so brutal that he declined to return a second time. Anne's private complaints were not scandalous, but they were pointed. She disliked the coldness of English rooms, the emptiness of English conversation, and the fact that so many people in the king's orbit insisted on pretending. She preferred hunting to embroidery. She preferred directness to flattery. And while she rarely raised her voice, when she did, it was in sudden explosive frustration, often about the dullness of court life or the endless games of etiquette. According to one servant, Anne once snapped during a formal dinner and asked, "How long must I nod and smile before I'm allowed to say what I think?" She didn't curse often, but she was known to mutter in German, fast, biting phrases that translators politely left out of the official records. Yet despite all this, Anne adapted, not by becoming what England expected, but by outlasting everyone who did. She outlived Henry, outlived 2 more queens, maintained her estates, kept her dignity, and behind the scenes she maintained a steady, simmering exasperation with the country that had both rejected and rewarded her. Anne of Cleves may not have been England's most volcanic royal, but she was a slow burn, a foreign ember that never quite went out. And for those who worked too closely with her or dared to correct her, She had a particular expression, a half smile, a narrowed glance, and the unmistakable sense that she was mentally composing a letter home, one in which your name was not spoken kindly. But if Anne learned to cloak her irritation in quiet wit, the next royal was far less subtle. Mary, Queen of Scots, didn't believe in hiding her anger behind courtesy. When she was wronged, or even mildly displeased, she let it be known with fire, tears, and a sharp tongue that could stun a room into silence. 9. Mary, Queen of Scots. Mary. Stuart was many things: a queen at 6 days old, a widow at 18, and a political fugitive before she was 30. But beneath the layers of legend, romanticism, and doomed dynastic ambition, Mary, Queen of Scots, was also, by many accounts, unapologetically sharp-tongued, easily offended, and unafraid to let someone know when they had tried her patience. Her reputation as charming and poetic often overshadows the more human truth. Mary could be blisteringly impatient. Her anger wasn't the slow-burn, closed-door kind. It flared quickly, in public, sometimes in multiple languages. She had been raised in the French court after all, trained in diplomacy, yes, but also in the art of the perfectly timed verbal slap. And when she returned to rule Scotland, she brought that European Polish with her, along with a growing intolerance for Scottish nobles, who didn't match her sense of refinement. Her courtiers quickly learned that Mary's court was not a place for casual incompetence. A minor misstep, a late arrival, a poorly phrased remark, an outfit deemed ill-considered, could trigger a scathing comment delivered with the musical cadence of a woman who had studied both theology and how to make a grown man regret his life choices in under 10 seconds. She had a particular habit of pausing just before speaking, as if she were generously allowing the other person one last chance to correct themselves. They rarely did. And then the words would come, measured, eloquent, and edged with such contempt that even her most loyal allies sometimes found themselves retreating into silence. Mary didn't need to curse to be brutal. Her language, especially in letters, was courtly, but it often carried the sting of disappointment laced with judgment. To one disobedient noble she wrote, "Your advice is as ill-timed as it is unwanted, and I suggest your energies be better spent in service, not suggestion." Translated, stay in your lane, and do it quietly. Her rage at betrayal was legendary. When her half-brother, the Earl of Moray, conspired against her, she didn't send assassins. She sent letters, long, eloquent, scalding letters that read like legal indictments written by a disappointed older sister with a memory like a steel trap. Nobles who crossed her didn't just face punishment. They faced the full rhetorical force of a monarch who could recite Latin, quote scripture, and still make it feel personal. But it wasn't just politics. Even in more domestic matters, Mary had little tolerance for nonsense. One lady-in-waiting recorded that Mary once dismissed her entire dressing staff for failing to properly arrange her gown's train before a ceremony. "I will not be made to look like a butcher's wife on Coronation Day," she reportedly snapped. The staff was reshuffled the next morning. Mary's frustration often came from a sense of being hemmed in by advisors, by expectations, by the rules of queenship in a country not quite ready for a Catholic woman with opinions. She was warm, yes, even affectionate. But when crossed, her warmth vanished like fog in sunlight. She didn't erupt in violence. She didn't humiliate for sport. But she let people know where they stood, and more importantly, where they no longer stood. Even in captivity, when she was held in England under Elizabeth I's watchful eye, Mary's letters retained their fire. Diplomats described her correspondence as spirited and unyielding, her tone regal yet impatient with delay. She refused to be forgotten, and even more so, refused to be dismissed. Mary may not have ruled long or ruled easily, but she ruled with feeling. And those feelings weren't always diplomatic. They were human, fierce, and at times deeply unfiltered. But if Mary's sharp tongue was born of heartbreak and political exile, the next royal on our list wielded hers with open glee. Because Queen Caroline of Brunswick didn't just insult people, she entertained herself doing it. Loudly, publicly, and with a vocabulary that scandalized even Georgian society. 10. Queen Caroline of Brunswick. To say that Queen Caroline of Brunswick was difficult is like saying the ocean is damp. She wasn't just a problem for the royal family. She was a full-time catastrophe wrapped in a bonnet, armed with insults, and apparently unaware that there were limits to what one could say in polite society. Or rather, she knew the limits. She simply trampled over them with the enthusiasm of someone who found restraint to be both boring and beneath her. Married to George IV in what can only be described as the most mutual of loathings, Caroline entered the British monarchy as an outsider and immediately began expressing how unimpressed she was with everything inside it. From the decor to the staff to the king himself, there was very little she liked, and she made sure everyone knew it. Loudly, she swore like a sailor, not behind closed doors, not in private letters, in drawing rooms, in gardens, during state functions. One courtier described her as a woman whose words were unguarded, unladylike, and delivered with the confidence of a general. Another called her a walking scandal. To be fair, that second one might have been from George himself. Caroline had no time for etiquette. She mispronounced the names of nobles on purpose. She called her ladies-in-waiting geese, if they annoyed her. She reportedly referred to one visiting bishop as that wet sock of a man, because he refused to sit next to her at dinner. At a public reception, she once introduced an ambassador's wife as the one who thinks too highly of herself and not enough of soap. The ambassador did not return. Her relationship with George IV was a symphony of mutual contempt. From the day they met, when George reportedly demanded brandy just to get through the wedding ceremony, Caroline made it clear she had no patience for his pretensions. She called him fat. She called him vain. She once referred to him as my porpoise in velvet. This was not whispered in private. She said it within earshot of staff. And when George tried to keep her away from court, she responded by hosting her own rival events, loudly declaring them less polished but more fun. But it wasn't just George she targeted. Caroline had little regard for the stiff, rule-bound rituals of the British aristocracy. She ignored court dress codes, spoke over important guests, and insisted on surrounding herself with people who amused her, often at the expense of those who didn't. At one party, she reportedly told a duke he was only here because the invitations got mixed up. He left early. She didn't notice. Caroline's vulgarity was almost a political statement. She refused to behave the way a queen was expected to, and in doing so, accidentally became something of a symbol for the public, at least the part of the public that also resented George's expensive tastes and never-ending demands for money. Crowds cheered her antics. Satirists adored her. Newspapers turned her insults into headlines. She was infuriating, unpredictable, and impossible to ignore. And she liked it that way. Her defiance wasn't just personal, it was performative. She made a spectacle of herself, partly out of revenge, partly out of instinct, and partly because she just found it all so deeply ridiculous. But while Caroline wielded her rudeness like a fan at a hot dinner party, waving it for dramatic effect, the next royal turned it into high art. Princess Margaret, Countess of Snowdon, didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She just looked at you like you'd already failed, and then made sure you knew exactly why. 11. Princess Margaret, Countess of Snowdon. Princess Margaret didn't yell. She didn't need to. She mastered a very different kind of brutality, the elegant kind, laced with diamonds and disappointment. If Queen Caroline was chaotic energy in lace gloves, Margaret was a scalpel in silk. Her insults were quieter, but far more fatal. They didn't just wound your pride, they made you rethink your life choices. The younger sister of Queen Elizabeth II, and forever trapped in the shadow of duty she didn't choose, Margaret turned condescension into a second language. And she was fluent. Her mere presence could silence a room, not with authority, but with a well-timed glance, a sigh, and a sip of whiskey that suggested everyone present had already lost her interest. She had a gift for the dismissive one-liner, the kind of comment that would sound harmless if written down, but in the moment, with her tone and timing, would send seasoned courtiers into existential spirals. She once looked a young staff member up and down and said, "Are you new or just poorly dressed?" The question was never answered. It didn't need to be. Margaret's impatience was not theatrical but steady, like background radiation. She had no time for inefficiency, fawning, or delay. A staffer who once brought her the wrong brand of mineral water was subjected to a full minute of silence, followed by the words, "Let's try that again, shall we?" The moment became palace folklore. New hires were warned. If she pauses before speaking, you've already failed. Unlike her sister who played the role of monarch with quiet endurance, Margaret seemed to relish her ability to shock and correct. She often acted as if politeness were an outdated fashion she'd decided not to bring back. Once, when asked at a formal dinner if she'd like a vegetarian option, she reportedly said, "I didn't fight my way out of the womb to eat lettuce." Laughter followed, but no one asked again. Those close to her knew there was a deep loyalty behind the frost, but the warmth had to be earned, carefully. She could be affectionate, generous, and wildly funny with people she liked, but if you fell out of favor, the temperature dropped immediately. Conversations became clipped. Invitations stopped arriving, and if you were really unlucky, she might describe you to others with a single, cutting phrase that would follow you for years. She called certain aristocrats decorative but dim. She once referred to a rising politician as ambitious in the wrong direction. And when a royal photographer annoyed her during a shoot, she snapped, "You're awfully bold for someone behind the camera." He didn't take another photo for hours. Margaret didn't care for public pretense. She hated small talk and wasn't shy about showing it. She had a habit of walking away mid-conversation when she got bored, sometimes in the middle of someone else's sentence. At diplomatic events, she sometimes corrected protocol officers, not kindly, not quietly, but with a tone that made it very clear she expected better and could not believe she had to say so out loud. Even those who admired her struggled to keep up. She moved through life like a royal storm, perfectly styled, never late, and frequently impossible. And perhaps most unnerving of all, she rarely apologized. If she insulted you, it was probably on purpose. If she didn't, it might have been worse, because it meant you weren't worth noticing. But if Margaret's cruelty was elegant and icy, the next royal on our list wore her sharpness with a different kind of grace. Queen Alexandra knew how to smile sweetly while cutting deep, often without raising her voice, but always with precision. Because some queens correct with command. Alexandra corrected with charm, charm so precise it hurt. 12. Queen Alexandra. Queen Alexandra moved through the world like a porcelain swan, regal, radiant, and seemingly delicate. But beneath the lace gloves and serene expressions lived a woman who could fillet your pride with a few well-chosen words and never once disturb the gentle drape of her silk gown. Her elegance wasn't just aesthetic, it was tactical, and her sharpness came not from rage, but from a quiet refusal to tolerate incompetence, disloyalty, or worst of all, mediocrity. She was married to Edward VII, a man whose personal life was expansive. While he was out enjoying his extended social duties, Alexandra built a fortress of dignity around herself and maintained it with iron discipline. Publicly adored and almost mythically graceful, she knew how to hold court with a smile. But behind the scenes, that smile could disappear in an instant, replaced with a clipped tone and an arched brow that could reduce even the most seasoned courtier to mumbling apologies. Alexandra wasn't the type to shout across a room. She didn't need to. Her displeasure was felt like a shift in barometric pressure. One minute the drawing room would hum with polite conversation. The next, someone would say the wrong thing, or arrive 5 minutes late. and a chill would settle over the entire gathering. It was subtle, impeccably timed, and unmistakably her doing. Those close to her, staff, friends, even family, described her as meticulous and deeply exacting. Not loud, not cruel, but pointed. Her corrections were often delivered in private, but they were rarely gentle. She was known to summon ladies-in-waiting not to scold them, but to explain, in devastating detail, what they had failed to notice. The tone was never raised, the critique was never repeated. Once was enough. She had a particular distaste for flattery, especially when it was poorly executed. When a visiting noble tried to compliment her appearance by referencing her age, she replied, "You are either blind or a fool, and I cannot say which is more offensive." The noble laughed, assuming it was a joke. It wasn't. Alexandra had already moved on. Even her daughters weren't exempt. One anecdote describes a family tea during which a young princess expressed frustration with a guest. Alexandra, without even looking up from her embroidery, said, "If you cannot find your manners, I suggest you lose your voice as well." The child reportedly didn't speak again until dessert. Her correspondence, usually written in flawless, looping script, revealed more of the same. She had a habit of underlining words not for emphasis, but for subtle rebuke. "I trust your judgment," underlined 3 times, did not mean she trusted it. It meant she expected better. Her letters were studied by recipients like scripture, combed for tone, subtext, and signs of favor or disapproval. Alexandra's brand of rudeness was rooted in expectations. She expected excellence, composure, and discretion, and when these were not delivered, she made her disappointment known with surgical clarity. A guest who overstayed their welcome might receive a parting remark like, "I do hope your journey home is shorter than your stay." Said with a smile, of course, but never forgotten. And yet, despite her barbed wit and unrelenting standards, Alexandra remained beloved. Possibly because of her precision. She was never erratic, never cruel without reason. She didn't pick fights. She simply ended them. With a word. With a look. Occasionally, with a sentence so perfectly constructed that it could have been chiseled onto the gates of Buckingham Palace as a warning to the ill-mannered. But where Alexandra cut with quiet elegance, the next royal in line came in like a gust of unfiltered wind. Queen Adelaide wasn't interested in poetry or subtle put-downs. When she was annoyed, you knew. Her words didn't wound politely. They arrived with the force of a door slammed in your face, and the handle snapped off behind it. 13. Queen Adelaide history remembers Queen Adelaide as devout, modest, and ever proper, the pious consort to the erratic King William IV, and a woman whose name has been politely attached to cities, ships, and colonial outposts. But behind the altar of good reputation lies a lesser-known reality. Adelaide had a temper, and not the brooding, poetic kind. Hers was crisp, immediate, and unfiltered, a sort of aristocratic honesty with sharp edges. She didn't explode often, but when she did, it was the sort of dignified eruption that left people stunned, confused, and instinctively apologizing for things they didn't do. Adelaide's rudeness didn't come from vanity or whimsy. It came from order. She had a fierce sense of rightness, moral, domestic, procedural. Everything had its place, and when things slipped out of alignment, whether it was a teacup set incorrectly or a courtier whispering too loudly during prayers, her patience snapped like a harp string. Quiet one moment, cutting the next. A lady-in-waiting once described the Queen's presence as a gust of cold air beneath a lace curtain. Elegant, yes, but brisk enough to make you stand up straighter and reconsider your tone. One misstep in her presence could invite a verbal correction delivered in a voice barely above a whisper, but somehow louder than a shout. Her words didn't rise, they sank, right into your confidence. Servants walked carefully around her, not because she was cruel, but because she noticed everything. One footman, new to the household, made the mistake of placing a breakfast tray 2 inches off-center. Adelaide did not shout. She simply looked at the tray, then at him, and said, The Queen of England is not partial to crooked mornings. He reportedly never misplaced another item again. Her expectations extended to everyone: family, staff, even clergy. Once, when a bishop failed to kneel at the appropriate time during chapel, Adelaide was seen leaning forward in her pew and stating, not loudly but firmly, "Even the proudest men must bow eventually." The bishop obliged, albeit with some visible confusion. Her disdain for disorder extended to court protocol as well. She loathed sloppiness in dress, irreverent laughter, and anything she deemed unseemly. When a noblewoman arrived late and out of breath to a royal function, Adelaide met her with the words, "It seems your clock and your corset are both untrustworthy," delivered without humor, with a nod. And then she moved on. Yet she was not unkind, just easily and visibly disappointed. Guests who tried to charm her with idle flattery often found themselves dismissed with an expression best described as diplomatic exhaustion. Her smiles were rare but meaningful. Her praise, when it came, was remembered for years. But so were her rebukes. Once, when a young courtier tried to curry favor with a too familiar joke about the king, Adelaide looked at him and said, "Wit should never come at the cost of dignity." The courtier laughed nervously. She didn't. Adelaide's temper was rooted in her unshakable sense of duty, decorum, and the belief that the royal household was a reflection of divine order. Anything less than perfect was a blemish, not just on the monarchy, but on morality itself. And when morality felt endangered, so did the calm of every room she entered. Behind the scenes, her staff learned to develop a near-psychic anticipation of her preferences. Flowers had to be arranged serenely, meals served without fuss, and letters written with clarity and calm. One poor valet, after fumbling a candlestick, was not dismissed, but rather informed. "Your nerves have no place near flame or sovereign." A poetic way of saying, "You're lucky to still be here." But while Adelaide's discipline carved a court of clockwork manners, the next royal on our list made no effort to soften, disguise, or dress up her fury. Queen Isabella of Angoulême, wife of King John, didn't believe in temper management. She believed in public shaming, personal domination, and unleashing her rage with medieval efficiency. 14. Queen Isabella of Angoulême. If there were ever a royal who made rudeness into a reigning philosophy, it was Queen Isabella of Angoulême. Wife of King John. Yes, that King John. The one who lost the crown jewels in a swamp and inspired every villainous version of royalty from here to Sherwood Forest. Isabella wasn't content to simply exist beside chaos. She contributed to it, shaped it, and often accelerated it with a verbal edge that even hardened barons found difficult to endure. Born into French nobility and thrust into the volatile English court at the tender age of 12, Isabella didn't ease her way into royalty. She arrived like a lightning strike and never fully calmed afterward. While John was busy alienating his nobles and picking fights with the church, Isabella was behind the scenes, raging at court ladies, humiliating rivals, and establishing herself as the queen you did not cross, unless you had a very good reason, and preferably a written will. Chroniclers of the time were not kind to her, but not even they could deny her sheer force of presence. One described her as having the temper of fire and the tongue of judgment. That's medieval shorthand for, she didn't care who you were, she would say what she thought of you, loudly, clearly, and often with witnesses. It was said she could silence a room just by entering it, not out of reverence but apprehension. Court attendants developed the uncanny ability to sense when Isabella was displeased, usually by the way she entered a hall, fast, heavy-footed, with her gloves still on. That was the signal. The day had taken a turn. Prepare for casualties. Isabella didn't confine her wrath to whispered snubs or passive aggression. She shamed nobles publicly, in front of guests, servants, foreign dignitaries. If someone brought her the wrong wine, she would loudly ask whether they were attempting to poison her. If a lady-in-waiting misstepped in court etiquette, Isabella would correct her on the spot with a tone that could strip paint off cathedral walls. Her relationship with the English nobility was famously hostile. Many of the barons viewed her as foreign, willful, and unmanageable, which, to be fair, she absolutely was. But it wasn't just xenophobia. Isabella treated the barons with visible disdain, referring to some of them as mud-born lords, and occasionally refusing to address them by name. She preferred title and tone, usually the cold, flat kind reserved for servants or misbehaving animals. One chronicler suggested that Isabella once held a banquet specifically to outshine the wife of a particularly influential baron, and when the woman arrived in what she thought was an extravagant gown, Isabella was already seated, wearing 2 gowns layered in gold thread, and reportedly announced, "Some of us do not need to shout to be seen, but here we are." The other woman left early. The court remembered the moment for years. Even after King John's death, Isabella didn't mellow. As the Queen Dowager, she returned to France and immediately plunged herself into political feuds, territorial disputes, and at least 2 full-blown rebellions. She ran her household with such severity that multiple attendants fled, citing a climate of unrest. One French noble, after a single conversation with her, reportedly said, "She is the only woman I have met who uses words like arrows and expects you to bleed with dignity." Isabella's legacy, like her life, is a tangle of ambition, pride, and high-octane hostility. She wasn't loved exactly, she wasn't trusted, but she was respected. In that uneasy, reluctant way, one respects a thunderstorm that never seems to pass. But where Isabella delivered insults like a mounted charge, quick, loud, and full of impact, the next name on our list weaponized scandal itself. Lady Caroline Lamb wasn't a queen, but she didn't need a crown to cause chaos. All she needed was a ballroom, a sharp tongue, and an audience unlucky enough to be within earshot. 15. Lady Caroline Lamb. Technically, she wasn't royalty, but try telling her that. Lady Caroline Lamb may not have worn a crown, but she waltzed through England's aristocratic circles with the confidence of someone who believed she could outwit half the nobility and outcurse the other half, and she often did. A niece of the Duke of Devonshire and married to William Lamb, future Prime Minister, she was firmly tethered to the royal orbit. But she moved through it like a comet, bright, loud, disruptive, and leaving behind a long trail of whispered stories and shattered social expectations. To be clear, Caroline didn't just speak her mind, she launched it, full velocity, into whatever room she was in. Her temper was as famous as her literary aspirations, and her vocabulary, when irritated, was more explosive than poetic. She once called a duchess an overdressed pudding with opinions, and that was at a children's event. On more formal occasions, she was known to shout across drawing rooms, interrupt conversations she found boring, and correct people in front of crowds. Not to embarrass them, she claimed, but because someone must have the courage to say what others are whispering. She had no filter, and perhaps no desire for one. If she disliked you, she'd make sure you found out quickly, and probably in front of others. A courtier who tried to outmaneuver her in a conversation was, in her words, like a goose lecturing a hawk on how to fly. If a hostess invited her to an event she found dull, Caroline might attend anyway, just to walk out after the first course and claim she had lost interest in the company but not in the wine. Her most famous target, however, was Lord Byron. Yes, that Lord Byron. Their whirlwind affair ended in chaos, scandal, and more than a few memorable quotes. After he dumped her, Caroline famously described him as mad, bad, and dangerous to know, a line that made it into every biography and half the romantic imagination of England. But what people forget is what she said afterward, at a dinner party, to a guest who brought up his name. "If I ever marry again, it will be to a statue, cold, unresponsive, and easier to break." While other women of her station maintained civility at all costs, Caroline practically hunted down conflict. She attended royal receptions uninvited. She cornered people she disliked in hallways and corrected their behavior in front of stunned footmen. She once described Queen Charlotte as a dried fig wrapped in pearls, a comment that, unsurprisingly, did not earn her many favors at court. Her staff endured her moods with a mixture of admiration and fear. Servants were often barked at, sometimes praised, occasionally dismissed on the spot if they rolled their eyes at the wrong moment. Her letters to friends, when not filled with literary ambitions, were jammed with critiques of everyone around her, their fashion, their grammar, their dance, technique. No detail was too small to insult, no reputation too polished to scratch. And yet, for all her chaos, Caroline was deeply intelligent. Her outbursts were not mindless. They were precise, performative, sometimes even rehearsed. She saw herself as a disruptor, someone sent into the stiff world of British high society to stir the pot. And she did, gleefully, for as long as anyone would let her. Eventually, her public antics became too much even for those who had once found her amusing. She was gradually edged out of polite society, but never quietly. She once stormed out of a ball declaring, "If you people are the future of England, I shall begin drinking heavily for the past." Lady Caroline Lamb may not have had royal blood, but she had royal audacity. She lived scandalously, spoke recklessly, and made enemies faster than most people made tea. But the next woman on our list didn't need drama to dominate a room. Wallis Simpson, Duchess of Windsor, made her contempt look like class, and delivered insults with a smile so elegant, it took people a full minute to realize they'd been dismissed. 16. Wallis Simpson, Duchess of Windsor. Wallis Simpson didn't need to raise her voice to ruin your evening. She didn't need to curse, slam doors, or throw tantrums. All she needed was a cigarette, a smile, and one of her perfectly timed observations, delivered in that dry American drawl that sounded, to British ears, like the beginning of a cultural apocalypse. Wallis was not a royal by birth, but she became a royal problem, and perhaps the most divisive woman ever to orbit the crown without wearing it. She was sharp, stylish, and infamously impossible to impress. If you arrived at a dinner party wearing the wrong shade of gloves or offering a clumsy compliment, Wallis wouldn't scold you. She would simply look at you, up then down, and say something like, "How brave of you to try that look in this light." You'd smile nervously. She'd already moved on. To the British establishment she was vulgar. To Edward VIII she was irresistible. To everyone else she was a woman who did not care what you thought, and would let you know that in increasingly creative ways. Even before the abdication crisis, Wallis had developed a reputation in society for her acerbic wit and her complete unwillingness to defer to people simply because they had titles. She once said of a minor royal, "He wears his family tree like a straitjacket, tight and utterly out of date." Those close to her described her conversation style as surgical. She didn't chatter. She observed, then dissected. Sometimes you didn't even realize you were being insulted until you got home and replayed the conversation. By then it was too late. The damage had been done, and done with such elegance that it felt almost like a privilege to have been targeted. Palace staff during Edward's brief reign, and even more so after his abdication, recounted endless stories of her private outbursts. Though she kept up appearances in public, behind closed doors she was known for her cutting remarks and her short temper, particularly when dealing with servants who failed to meet her exacting standards. One valet recalled being told, "You iron like you've never seen fabric before. Please don't do it again." That was his final day of employment. Wallis also had a gift for passive aggression. When invited to a royal event she found tedious, she would RSVP with a note reading, "We will try to make it, unless something more cheerful arises." When someone she disliked sent her flowers, she returned them. With a card that read, "These belong in your own drawing room, where the color scheme is more forgiving." Even Edward, the man who gave up a throne for her, was not spared. She referred to him, half-jokingly, as the little man, and once told a friend, "He abdicated, but somehow I ended up doing all the work." In public, she maintained the image of the chic, graceful partner. In private, She managed their household with a precision that bordered on military and corrected Edward's conversational missteps mid-sentence. To their guests. And yet she held the room, wherever she went. Even among the royals who loathed her, Wallis was impossible to ignore. You might hate her, but you would not forget her. Her style was impeccable, her sarcasm perfectly timed, her contempt crystalline. She was the sort of woman who could slice a man's ego in half and still be asked to dinner the next night. But while Wallis Simpson wielded icy sarcasm like a perfectly cut diamond, the next royal on our list was a woman whose fury burned more openly. Princess Sophia Dorothea of Celle had no time for charm or patience, and when provoked, she let her outrage pour forth in streams of unapologetic, unfiltered fury. 17. Princess Sophia Dorothea of Celle. If ever there was a cautionary tale about what happens when you marry a woman off for political convenience and then expect her to keep smiling through it, Princess Sophia Dorothea of Celle is it. She entered history as the wronged wife of the future George I, a man so cold, so disinterested, and so committed to sidelining her that it's a miracle she didn't light the entire Hanoverian court on fire. But instead of flames, Sophia Dorothea chose fury, verbal, relentless, and unmistakably sharp. Sophia Dorothea wasn't raised for the British throne. She was a German princess, born into nobility but not quite royal, and married off young in a union that benefited everyone except her. Her husband, the Elector of Hanover, had no affection for her and made no effort to hide it. He spent most of their marriage with his mistress, Melusine von der Schulenburg, whose presence at court was so constant it may as well have been an official appointment. Sophia Dorothea, unsurprisingly, had opinions about this arrangement, and she didn't keep them to herself. She developed a reputation early for what diplomats politely referred to as blunt speech. Behind closed doors, it was more than blunt, it was volcanic. Court reports describe her as vehement in her displeasure, prone to lashing out at servants, ladies-in-waiting, and occasionally foreign dignitaries who had the misfortune of catching her in a mood. And her moods, it turns out, were numerous and easily triggered. She swore in German, frequently and vividly. If you happened to understand the language, it was hard not to flinch. Her fury was theatrical. It didn't just simmer. It arrived in full, with slammed doors, shouted accusations, and the kind of insults that left reputations limping for weeks. She once called a visiting noblewoman a painted toad with pearls, and reportedly said of her husband, "He has the soul of a banker and the face of a dried fish." She said this not in private, but at a public supper after 2 glasses of wine, in full earshot of half the court. Servants, it was said, developed a sort of radar for her temper. If she walked into a room too quietly, it meant trouble. If she paused before speaking, it meant something or someone had already disappointed her. Her verbal precision made her feared by those closest to her. One lady-in-waiting wrote that Sophia Dorothea could dress you down without once raising her voice, but with such contempt that one longed to vanish through the floor. Her most famous outburst came during one of many confrontations with her husband. After being accused of emotional coldness, she is said to have thrown a glass across the room, not at him, but near enough to make the point, and shouted, "You mistake tolerance for affection. I have given you too much of the former, and none of the latter." He reportedly left the room. She stayed, furious, but victorious. Of course, her outspokenness didn't win her many allies. She was eventually accused, dubiously, of having an affair with a nobleman, and was imprisoned for the rest of her life in the castle of Alden. For over 30 years, she lived in isolation, kept from her children and her titles, silenced by decree if not by will. But even then, even in exile, her sharpness survived. Letters smuggled out from her confinement were filled with sarcasm, bitterness, and unmistakable jabs at the family that had locked her away. In one she wrote, "There is no better mirror for a king than the wife he discarded. Let him look carefully and see what he truly values. It was a direct hit, delivered from behind stone walls. Sophia Dorothea may have died out of sight, but she never faded. Her anger, righteous and unfiltered, still echoes through the archives. And the next woman on our list shared something of that fury, only cloaked in religious piety and a queen's crown. Mary of Modena, consort to James II, may have appeared holy, but behind that pious expression was a woman whose tongue could scorch a court when provoked. 18. Mary of Modena. She was supposed to be the quiet one, the devout one, the uncontroversial Italian Catholic queen who, by marrying James II of England, would bring grace, piety, and a touch of continental elegance to the stormy politics of the late Stuart court. And in many ways, Mary of Modena delivered exactly that, on the surface. But beneath the layers of lace, incense, and soft-spoken religiosity was a woman who did not suffer disruption, did not tolerate disrespect, and absolutely did not remain silent when provoked. Mary's reputation for holy endurance was not entirely wrong, but what the court often forgot, and what her attendants never did, was that her faith came with fire. And that fire found its voice in scathing rebukes, icy corrections, and the kind of verbal authority that made even senior courtiers fumble their words. She wasn't dramatic. She didn't throw fits. What she did was worse. She scolded with moral clarity, the kind of clarity that left the listener feeling not just corrected, but vaguely damned. Her temper, when it surfaced, was not wild but terrifyingly focused. A misplaced bow, an ill-timed remark, or a servant arriving 3 minutes late could trigger what her ladies-in-waiting came to call the Modena moment. A period of prolonged, deliberate silence followed by one or two impeccably chosen sentences that somehow managed to sound like a sermon, a lecture, and a royal decree all at once. When Mary snapped, she did so with the precision of someone who had been waiting. One courtier described the experience of being on the receiving end of her disapproval as like hearing your own eulogy from someone who still expects you to serve lunch afterward. There was no yelling, just tone, and the tone was devastating. She particularly disliked frivolity. If a noblewoman made a crude joke or laughed too loudly, Mary would pause, tilt her head slightly, and say something like, "Let us pray the angels do not share your sense of humor." If a servant spilled wine, she didn't shout. She simply stood up from the table and left the room. The entire meal would end with her exit. That was her style. She didn't argue. She rendered judgment. Despite being a foreign queen in an increasingly hostile Protestant England, Mary held her ground. She did not bend to English tastes. She did not abandon her Catholic practices. And she certainly did not pretend to enjoy the courtiers who whispered about her accent and speculated about her womb. When rumors circulated that she had faked the birth of her son to secure a Catholic heir, she responded not with diplomacy but disdain, calling the accusers liars in velvet and creatures who dress like gentlemen but speak like drunkards. Mary's private household ran like a monastic court. Silence was expected. Cleanliness was enforced. Her ladies were required to attend daily prayer, observe fast days, and refrain from gossip. Those who didn't, they were dismissed without discussion. One lady-in-waiting who complained about the rules was reportedly told, "If holiness is a burden, you may unburden yourself elsewhere." She was sent home the next morning. Mary's faith didn't mellow her. It sharpened her. She believed her position, her marriage, and even her suffering were divine appointments. As such, she viewed incompetence as a sin against order, and sins, she believed, should be met with clarity. Her letters reflect this same style, measured, eloquent, and filled with unspoken judgment. To a relative who had embarrassed the royal family at a public gathering, she wrote, "Decorum is not a gift but a duty. When it is missing, we are all the poorer." That was the last letter she ever sent to them. Even in exile, after James II was deposed and the couple fled to France, Mary maintained her steel. She ruled the exiled Jacobite court with a firm hand, issuing commands and dismissals with the same serene finality she'd practiced at Whitehall. French courtiers admired her elegance. English exiles feared her judgment. Mary of Modena remains a lesson in quiet authority. Not the kind that shouts over you, but the kind that leaves you echoing your own mistakes. And while she ruled her household like a chapel, the next royal was nothing like a saint. Queen Mary of Teck, grandmother of Elizabeth II, didn't preach. She inspected, and when she found something, or someone, out of line, her words were swift, cold, and delivered with the calm menace of a woman who expected better from absolutely everyone. 19. Queen Mary of Teck. To be scolded by Queen Mary of Teck was not merely to be corrected. It was to be audited, morally and aesthetically, by a woman who had already decided that the empire itself was only as dignified as your posture and your punctuality. She was the grandmother of Queen Elizabeth II, consort to King George V, and the steel backbone behind decades of royal ceremony, discipline, and barely contained disdain. Queen Mary didn't yell. She didn't need to. Her disapproval came in the form of silence, subtle shaming, and sentences so crisp and cold they could have been served with ice and a lemon slice. From the moment she stepped into public life, Mary of Teck made it clear she expected order, reverence, and a precisely measured teaspoon of deference. She had no tolerance for laziness, untidiness, lateness, or conversational flippancy. Woe to the staff member who addressed her casually, or, heaven forbid, attempted humor in her presence. One footman made the mistake of laughing during a formal reception. She didn't look at him. She simply said, "Is there something amusing about representing the crown?" There wasn't. He was gone within the week. She cultivated an atmosphere of composed intimidation, not out of malice but from a belief that royalty must be royal at all times, even in private, especially in private. She did not slouch, she did not improvise, she did not tolerate emotional messes. If someone near her cried, she didn't offer comfort. She offered tissues, and then asked them to step outside until they had composed themselves. Visitors to her drawing room often left feeling as though they'd just sat for an oral exam administered by an ancient library. Even family members were not immune. Her own daughter-in-law, Queen Elizabeth the Queen Mother, once described Mary as a fortress of correctness, and even that was generous. She corrected children mid-sentence, adults mid-thought, and ministers mid-briefing. A junior royal who once referred to a palace event as fun was immediately interrupted with, "The monarchy is not here to amuse itself. Kindly remember that." Mary's method of criticism was restrained but lethal. She would not raise her voice, but she would glance at your shoes, your tie, your choice of words, and something in her expression would shift just slightly, enough for you to know you had failed some invisible test, and then she would move on, leaving the uncomfortable silence in her wake like the residue of a minor curse. Even her compliments carried weight. If Queen Mary said you had improved, it meant she had previously considered you a disgrace. If she said your work was satisfactory, it was a triumph. Staff learned to parse her language the way archaeologists decode ancient tablets, carefully, anxiously, and with respect for the possibility of doom. Despite this, or perhaps because of it, Mary was deeply respected. She had an unshakable sense of duty and a near superhuman commitment to ceremonial precision. She arrived early. She dressed perfectly. She never forgot a name, a face, or a protocol detail, and she expected others to do the same. She believed absolutely in monarchy as performance, and in performance there is no room for improvisation. Her temper, when it surfaced, was tightly wrapped in formality. She once scolded a senior servant for failing to arrange the silver correctly with the words, "I understand you've been here a long time. How unfortunate that time has not improved your standards." The remark traveled through the palace like wildfire. Even her maternal instincts were filtered through duty. Her children were raised in a household of structure and restraint. They were expected to represent the crown from the cradle. One biographer noted that Mary's idea of warmth was allowing an extra 5 minutes of piano practice before bedtime. Yet even they, her children, acknowledged that her expectations created stability, at a price. Queen Mary didn't curse. She didn't explode. But her presence alone could crush spontaneity. And if she was disappointed in you, she would let you know. Not through dramatics, but through cold elegance, and 1 or 2 sentences that would echo in your mind for years. But while Queen Mary enforced royal dignity like a headmistress on Judgment Day, the next royal took an entirely different approach. Princess Anne, the Princess Royal, doesn't dress up her disdain. She doesn't sugarcoat her orders. And when she's irritated, she tells you, directly, loudly, and often with the kind of bluntness that could knock over a horse. 20. Princess Anne, the Princess Royal. Princess Anne doesn't do nonsense. She doesn't do flattery, sycophants, or small talk for its own sake. What she does do is walk 3 steps ahead of everyone else, mutter under her breath about delays, and deliver withering one-liners with all the subtlety of a military briefing. Unlike the velvet-gloved disdain of her royal ancestors, Anne's style of rudeness is entirely modern, brusque, efficient, and often accidentally hilarious. But behind the eye rolls and famous impatience is a woman who expects the world to move faster, function better, and keep up, or kindly get out of the way. Anne, the only daughter of Queen Elizabeth II, grew up in the most carefully controlled institution on earth and responded to it by becoming possibly the most unapologetically blunt person inside it. While her brothers fumbled through scandals, divorces, and drama, Anne stayed the course, quietly, steadily, and with a facial expression that suggests she's already fed up with the current topic. Or you. Or both. She doesn't suffer fools. She doesn't even pretend to. Staff members have long reported that working with Anne is like working under a very firm headmistress. If the headmistress also rode horses at Olympic level and could cut you down with a single raised eyebrow. When one aide tried to explain a revised schedule using corporate speak, "We're pivoting to optimize the public-facing narrative," Anne allegedly replied, "Are we doing it or just talking about it?" Then she walked out of the room. Even her public engagements are colored by her impatience with inefficiency. She keeps to schedule, often to the second. When events run late, because of photo ops, dignitary speeches, or any form of dawdling, she grows visibly annoyed. A well-known anecdote from a charity event involves Anne checking her watch mid-speech, sighing audibly, and then whispering to her aide, "We'll be lucky to make lunch before tea." Her dislike of ceremony for ceremony's sake is equally legendary. She rarely smiles for cameras. She's been known to ignore reporters. Once, when asked how it felt to be the hardest-working royal, she shrugged and said, "That's just the job, isn't it? No spin, no sparkle, just grit." And then there's the swearing. While not officially documented on palace letterhead, reports from former staff, security, and even drivers suggest that Anne is more than fluent in the colorful side of the English language. Her vocabulary, while never aired on camera, is said to be expressive, concise, and deployed in moments of logistical frustration. She's the type to stub a toe on a chair leg and make the chair feel sorry. But even without strong language, Anne can be scathing. When one journalist asked her how she stayed out of the tabloids, she replied, "I keep my head down. You might try it." When introduced to a minor celebrity at a royal garden party, she reportedly asked, "And what do you do that requires a camera?" The question was rhetorical. The point had already been made. Yet, despite her legendary impatience and sharp tongue, Princess Anne is widely respected, and often adored. Because beneath the briskness is a woman who works relentlessly, shows up early, and expects excellence because she delivers it herself. There's no vanity in her rudeness, no thirst for attention. She doesn't want to dominate a room. She just wants it to stop wasting her time. If Princess Margaret's sharpness was laced with performance, and Queen Mary of Tex with ceremony, Anne's is born of utility. She isn't cold, she's focused. And she doesn't have the bandwidth for foolishness when there are 20 engagements on the calendar and a horse waiting back at the stables. And yet, if Anne's temper is brisk and clipped, the next Royals was flamboyant in a very different register. Princess Alice of Athlone, the longest-lived granddaughter of Queen Victoria, had charm, certainly, but she also had a habit of turning tea parties into tactical debriefings and staff meetings into moral interrogations, all while delivering barbed commentary through a cloud of perfume and perfect posture. 21. Princess Alice of Athlone. Princess Alice of Athlone lived through 3 centuries of royal evolution and managed to offend someone in nearly all of them. Born in 1883, the granddaughter of Queen Victoria and a cousin to just about every European monarch worth naming, Alice seemed to come pre-equipped with the knowledge that she was important, and the expectation that everyone else ought to act accordingly. She was elegant, well-read, fluent in several languages, and absolutely brutal when her patience ran out, which it did frequently and with very little warning. She was, by all accounts, charming when she wanted to be. That is, until the tea was too cold, the curtains too loud, or the conversation too stupid. Then the charm faded, and out came the tongue. A refined, aristocratic instrument, but honed to a razor's edge. Alice didn't explode. She sliced, and she always made sure the cut landed exactly where it would sting the most. Staff members in her various royal residences, most notably in Canada, where she lived while her husband served as Governor General, told stories of a princess who could terrify with timing alone. A single raised eyebrow, delivered at precisely the wrong moment, was enough to derail an entire formal dinner. Her rebukes came fast, dry, and with unnerving precision. When one footman poured her tea with the milk first, she simply stared at the cup and said, "Is that how your mother taught you to ruin things?" He was never seen again, or at least not in the main house. Even family members treaded lightly. She maintained a genteel exterior, but underneath was a core of iron. Her daughter once remarked that being raised by Alice was like attending a finishing school where nothing was ever quite finished. In other words, Alice was constantly correcting manners, grammar, posture, attitudes, even facial expressions. A slouched spine could earn a comment like, "If you mean to impersonate a question mark, at least be eloquent." And somehow she always said it with a smile. Though she lived in an era that praised royal aloofness, Alice's version of aloof was personal. She didn't just stand above people, she informed them that they were below her. But not in a crass way, in the way one might inform a guest that they've arrived at the wrong address. "How unfortunate," she once said to a dinner guest whose name she pretended to forget. "I'd hoped for more interesting company." He laughed nervously. She didn't. Alice's temper wasn't explosive, but it was relentless. She held grudges with the same elegance she held her opera glasses. Offenses were recorded, not loudly, but permanently. If you crossed her, you might still receive an invitation to the next event, but you would be seated near the kitchen and ignored all evening. Passive-aggressive, yes, but so flawlessly executed that the victim often apologized afterward without quite knowing why. Still, there was admiration beneath the apprehension. Alice worked hard, traveled widely, and represented the crown with distinction. Her standards were unforgiving because she lived by them herself. She expected perfection not for vanity's sake, but because in her mind, royalty was a craft, and anyone who practiced it sloppily was an insult to the institution. She lived to be 97, long enough to see the monarchy change shape entirely. And yet, even in her final years, she remained unimpressed with modernity. When asked in an interview about the younger royals embracing more casual behavior, she famously replied, "There is nothing casual about monarchy. That's rather the point, isn't it?" So while others aged into gentleness, Alice aged into legend, a woman whose perfume entered the room 10 seconds before she did, whose opinions arrived 10 seconds after you'd hoped they wouldn't, and whose corrections could still be felt weeks later. But if Alice preferred her rudeness scented with civility, the next royal applied none of that polish. Princess Louise, Duchess of Argyll, daughter of Queen Victoria, was a walking contradiction, artistic, progressive, and secretly volcanic. Her temper came fast, flared high, and often left witnesses wondering what exactly they'd done to trigger the storm. 22. Princess Louise, Duchess of Argyll. Princess Louise, the sixth child of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert, was not the sort of royal who fit neatly into the family mold. She was rebellious, fiercely intelligent, politically engaged, and inconveniently unafraid of expressing herself, especially when irritated. And she was irritated often. Beneath her cultured artistic veneer was a woman of sharp impatience and a legendary temper that arrived without fanfare but left a mark, usually in the form of a verbal dressing down that no one soon forgot. While her siblings followed the predictable paths of military titles and ceremonial obedience, Louise chose something different. She became a sculptor, professionally. She attended art school under an alias. She traveled. She spoke up. And she refused, stubbornly, to be treated like royal decoration. Her refusal came with consequences: awkward family dinners, tense public appearances, and a running list of people she snapped at, corrected, or simply ignored. Palace staff found her demanding, sometimes exhausting, and occasionally terrifying. She had a habit of speaking quickly when annoyed, her voice climbing not in volume but in velocity. Her frustration would spill out in rapid-fire critiques, often laced with biting sarcasm. One housemaid recalled being asked to bring tea, only to have the princess sigh and remark, "It's astonishing how something can be both late and tepid, much like its deliverer." Louise's reputation for sharpness extended to her family. She was openly critical of her mother, Queen Victoria, who viewed artistic ambition as unseemly for a woman, let alone a royal. Their letters crackled with passive aggression. In one, Victoria accused Louise of indulging in unnecessary independence. Louise replied, "Independence, if unnecessary, must be tolerated. Otherwise, it becomes necessary indeed." It was the kind of comment that would make a courtier gasp, and then pretend they hadn't heard it. When Louise married John Campbell, Marquess of Lorne, later Duke of Argyll, it was seen as a bold move. She was the first British princess in centuries to marry a non-royal. She reportedly chose him herself, then spent much of the marriage regretting it. Their union was complicated, and so were their arguments. Staff at Kensington Palace told stories of doors closing loudly, never slamming, of course. It was a royal household, and muffled exchanges that sounded more like political debates than marital disagreements. In public, Louise maintained a cool composure, but in private, she was infamous for losing patience with slow conversation, pretentious guests, and the suffocating rituals of royal life. She once described a formal dinner as an overcooked performance with undercooked company. She was not invited to the follow-up event. Her quick temper extended to matters of social justice. Louise was known to challenge condescending remarks made by aristocrats, particularly men. During a conversation about women's education, when a nobleman opined that women should be content with the home, Louise reportedly replied, "Which is difficult when the home has been designed to cage and not to comfort." He tried to laugh. She did not. She also famously did not care for obsequiousness. She could spot flattery from 10 yards and would dismiss it with a wave, or worse, a follow-up question designed to make the flatterer squirm. "Is that what you think?" she once asked a sycophantic guest. "Or what you were told to say to get the invitation?" The guest was never seen again, at least not at Kensington. Yet for all her heat, Louise was admired for her candor. In a court where everything was couched in etiquette and innuendo, her directness was almost revolutionary. She was not warm, she was not always kind, but she was real, in a way that made her contemporaries deeply uncomfortable and historians deeply intrigued. And if Louise was the royal who dared to snap back at her own dynasty, the next queen on our list was one who snapped at England itself. Queen Henrietta Maria, wife of Charles I, didn't just insult people. She insulted cultures, policies, parliaments, and anyone foolish enough to question her authority, whether in French, English, or a multilingual scolding that made courtiers wish they were somewhere else entirely. 23. Queen Henrietta Maria. To step into the presence of Queen Henrietta, Maria was to enter a storm disguised as a salon. Born a Bourbon princess of France and married into the unstable tightrope act of Stuart England, Henrietta Maria arrived in London with silks, servants, and an unapologetically sharp tongue that rarely dulled with time or diplomacy. The English expected her to assimilate quietly. What they got was a queen consort who treated Parliament with disdain, mocked English customs to their faces, and viewed compromise as a spiritual weakness. Her rudeness wasn't careless. It was crafted, strategic, born of rank, religion, and an unshakable belief that the English court was about 4 centuries behind in both etiquette and manners. She didn't just ignore the sensibilities of her Protestant subjects, she challenged them directly. At state banquets, she spoke French. In private, she ridiculed Anglican services as pale performances. When Parliament grumbled about her Catholic chaplains, she increased their number. And when courtiers attempted polite protest, she responded with arch smiles and devastating put-downs delivered with aristocratic calm. One noble, having taken the bold step of questioning her influence over King Charles I, received from her what was later described as a lesson in humiliation disguised as conversation. She fixed him with a look and said, "If silence cannot improve you, sir, then words shall not bother." He bowed as expected. He also never spoke in her presence again. Her marriage to Charles I was, in its own way, a theater of contrasting tones. He, reserved and politically tone-deaf. She, animated, extravagant, and so direct that she routinely offended half the Privy Council before breakfast. While Charles struggled to maintain dignity in an increasingly hostile political climate, Henrietta Maria was known to shout at ministers she disliked, accuse officials of cowardice, and dismiss criticism as English noise. She did not whisper behind fans. She made her contempt a matter of record. Henrietta Maria's private letters, many of which survive, are a goldmine of unapologetic sarcasm. In one, she refers to an English bishop as a man who knows God by hearsay and governs by guesswork. In another, she describes a Protestant envoy as courteous but confused. He believes women cannot reason and proves it by reasoning with me. Her correspondence is peppered with little jabs, side-eye and ink, delivered with impeccable grammar and lethal punctuation. Courtiers both feared and admired her. Her ladies-in-waiting learned to tread carefully. She had no patience for sloppiness, laziness, or any suggestion that her French upbringing was not the superior cultural model. One maid who laid out her clothes in the wrong sequence was reportedly greeted with the remark, "Your imagination is better suited to laundry than order." She was reassigned. Others soon learned that with Henrietta Maria, efficiency was survival. Even in exile, her temper did not mellow. After fleeing to France during the English Civil War, she maintained a kind of exiled court in miniature, smaller in size, not in standards. Diplomats who visited her described her as regal in despair, issuing commands with the precision of a woman who refused to admit she had lost a kingdom. One observer noted that she corrected her household with the same severity she reserved for Parliament. Given that Parliament had executed her husband, this was not meant as a compliment. And yet, Henrietta Maria was never aimless in her anger. Her sharpness was tied to her sense of purpose. She saw herself as a defender of monarchy, faith, and tradition, all under siege from what she saw as the rising vulgarity of parliamentary power and Puritan austerity. Her enemies saw her as a meddling foreigner. Her allies saw her as the only person at court willing to say what needed to be said. But of course, her outbursts weren't without consequence. Her vocal Catholicism, open defiance of Protestant expectations, and public criticisms of English leadership helped fuel the growing resentment that would eventually ignite the English Civil War. The nation blamed her for manipulating the king, for funding royalist armies, for undermining Parliament, most of which inconveniently was true. She was not a shadow queen. She was a commanding force, and she made no effort to disguise it. Even in widowhood, Henrietta Maria continued to provoke. After the restoration of the monarchy under her son, Charles II, she returned briefly to England, but not quietly. She brought with her Catholic attendants, French fashion, and the same glacial scorn for those who had once tried to rule in her absence. Her presence at court was ceremonial, but her commentary was not. When asked whether she had regrets, she replied, "Only that I was ever expected to tolerate fools in the name of diplomacy." Henrietta Maria wasn't beloved in the way some queens are remembered, but she was unforgettable. She left behind a reputation for discipline, stubbornness, and the kind of aristocratic scolding that made even the bravest noblemen recheck their cravats and their consciences. But where Henrietta Maria fired her contempt outward, toward nations, institutions, and entire religions, the next royal made it deeply personal. Eleanor of Aquitaine, Queen of both France and England, didn't just speak her mind. She sharpened it like a sword and aimed it at kings, clerics, and even her own children. Because when Eleanor insulted you, it wasn't just for effect. It was to remind you that she had already ruled you in her mind and found you lacking. 24. Eleanor of Aquitaine. If Queen Henrietta Maria was a storm wrapped in silk, Eleanor of Aquitaine was an empire wrapped in fury. She didn't just inherit vast lands, she was the land. In the minds of many of her contemporaries, Aquitaine was hers, its wealth, its power, its culture, its temperament. And when she married two kings, first of France, then of England, it wasn't just political, it was personal. Because Eleanor didn't enter palaces to decorate them. She entered to bend them to her will, and if anyone got in the way, she used the most precise weapon she had, her words. Eleanor was sharp, clever, worldly, and dangerous. She was also, by all reliable accounts, unfiltered. She mocked people to their faces, and somehow they still bowed. Her insults didn't come in heated outbursts. They were calculated and cool, layered with literary references, political digs, and the kind of intimate observation that left people questioning their own worth. She spoke not like a courtier, but like a playwright, and her favorite genre was tragedy, in which you were the underwhelming lead. Raised in the flamboyant and literary court of Aquitaine, Eleanor was surrounded by poets, philosophers, and troubadours. From a young age, she learned how language could humiliate, seduce, inspire, or destroy. She didn't just master courtly manners, she weaponized them. And when she married Louis VII of France, she made one thing clear: she was not interested in playing the meek and obedient queen. He preferred sermons, she preferred satire. The match, as one chronicler delicately put it, lacked concord. She called Louis a monk in a crown. He responded with silence, then crusades. It didn't last. But her next marriage, to Henry II of England, was no quieter. If Louis had disappointed her with piety, Henry tested her with brutality. Their relationship was built on passion, ambition, and intermittent detestation. When he betrayed her, politically or personally, she didn't retreat. She plotted, she undermined, she criticized. She may have technically rebelled against him, but long before she raised armies, she raised eyebrows, publicly rebuking him, scolding his advisors, and referring to his court as a school for the morally delayed. There are stories, many of them suspiciously well preserved, about how she corrected bishops, mocked barons, and publicly belittled those who tried to cross her. At a banquet in Normandy, after a noble made a rude comment about her origins, she reportedly turned to him and said, "I come from poets and kings. You come from nothing and have proven it." According to legend, the entire hall fell silent. No one refilled his wine, Eleanor wasn't content with just being queen. She was a political strategist, a cultural patron, a mother of kings. And when her sons disappointed her, which they frequently did, she made her displeasure explicit. Richard the Lionheart won her respect. John did not. She once referred to John's ambitions as the mischief of a child who breaks what he cannot build. That was her own son, the one who would later become king. But Eleanor didn't believe in letting power excuse poor character, especially not when she'd spent her life defining both. Her letters were masterclasses in controlled sarcasm. One bishop who wrote to her requesting funds for a religious project received a polite but pointed reply. "I commend your faith, but not your accounting. God, I am sure, prefers honest balance sheets." Another official who dared question her authority during one of her regencies was dismissed with the phrase, "When you have governed something greater than your own supper table, do right again." She was not an easy queen. She was not, by many accounts, a kind queen. But she was effective, ruthless, and brilliant. She used her intellect like a mirror, forcing people to see the worst in themselves, and her tongue like a scalpel, cutting directly to the weakness. She held together realms, navigated dynastic chaos, endured imprisonments, and negotiated with popes. Through it all, she maintained her command of language, and she never wasted a sentence on someone unworthy of the syllables. Even in her later years, when many queens retreat into sainted nostalgia, Eleanor remained formidable. She outlived 2 kings, buried multiple children, and still managed to write letters scolding monks, managing royal marriages, and reminding the next generation exactly what kind of woman they had underestimated. At her core, Eleanor was a queen who never asked to be liked, only respected. And if you didn't give her that respect, she'd take it anyway. Verbally, publicly, permanently. But while Eleanor of Aquitaine's fury was legendary and intellectually lethal, the final woman on our list concealed her sharpness behind a grandmotherly grin. Queen Elizabeth. The Queen Mother may be remembered for her pastel hats and smiling waves, but those who crossed her knew better. Behind the gentle facade was a matriarch who could freeze you solid with a single well-enunciated sentence, and who never, ever forgot an insult. 25. Queen Elizabeth. The Queen Mother. If elegance could kill softly, Queen Elizabeth. The Queen Mother would have left a trail of smiling corpses in her wake. To the British public, she was the nation's reassuring figurehead during its darkest hours, the cheerful wartime queen, the royal matriarch, the woman who smiled through the Blitz and wore pastel hats like they were armor. But behind the toothy grin and the china teacups was a razor-sharp sense of judgment and a memory like a steel trap. She may not have shouted, but she never forgot. And when she was displeased, you felt it not in thunderclaps, but in frost. Unlike her husband, King George VI, who agonized over speeches and preferred to blend into the wallpaper of his own monarchy, Elizabeth Bowes Lyon was comfortable in her power. She was quick with a compliment, quicker with a correction, and fastest of all with a one-liner that could leave an ambassador apologizing in 2 languages. Her rudeness was never overt. That would have been beneath her. No, the Queen Mother specialized in what could only be called aristocratic venom. Polished, polite, and timed like a Swiss watch. In court circles, she was known for being impossibly charming until she wasn't. A lady-in-waiting once described her temper as like standing in a blizzard, only to realize the snowflakes are tiny daggers. She didn't yell, she didn't glare. She tilted. She would glance at you with a slight downturn of the mouth and say something that, on paper, sounded almost kind, until you realized you'd been publicly corrected and privately dismissed in the same breath. For example, at a formal event, when a nervous young aristocrat complimented her gown with the phrase, "Your Majesty looks very comfortable," she reportedly replied, "Darling, the point of couture is to look better than you feel. Surely you'll learn that someday." A pause, a sip of champagne, a change of subject. The poor man never quite recovered. And then there was her handling of the real drama, the abdication. When Edward VIII stepped down to marry Wallis Simpson, it was Elizabeth who held the line. Officially, she offered support to her suddenly crowned husband. Privately, she never forgave Edward or Wallis, ever. To her dying day, she referred to the Duchess of Windsor as that woman, a term loaded with enough centuries of class disdain to weigh down a ship. And when Wallis sent her a polite letter decades later, Elizabeth reportedly read it aloud to a guest, said nothing, and dropped it into the fireplace. The Queen Mother also had a famously aristocratic view of the press, commoners with opinions, and, perhaps most amusingly, certain segments of the modern royal family. She once referred to a television interview with a young Prince Charles as an unnecessary display of feelings. When asked for her thoughts on the new breed of relatable royals, she allegedly smiled and said, "One should never mistake familiarity for favor or for respect." Within the family, her power was soft, but absolute. She ran Clarence House like a court within a court, complete with velvet furnishings and expectations of obedience. Guests who arrived without proper attire were either ignored or gently instructed to return when they were dressed less like weekend help. Even her grandchildren knew when to tread lightly. While Charles adored her, even he admitted, "You always knew when you'd said the wrong thing." The silence was the clue. Then came the look. Staff at her residence spoke of the voice, a particular tone she used when mildly displeased. Not angry, not scolding, just disappointed. One footman described it as being turned into mist. Another said, "She could ruin your week by saying your name too slowly." She also had a dry wit, used more often than not to slice through pretense. At a formal dinner in the 1980s, seated next to a young American politician trying too hard to impress her with his knowledge of British history, she reportedly said, "How interesting. Most people wait until they're knighted before attempting to lecture me." Still, for all the silk and ice, the Queen Mother was deeply effective. She held the monarchy together during crisis, molded the image of the modern royal family, and protected it with a vigilance that could feel both maternal and martial. Her steel was wrapped in tulle, but it was steel nonetheless. She lived to 101, outlasting wars, scandals, and half the aristocracy. People called her warm, witty, charming, and she was, until you crossed her. Then you'd find yourself smiling, nodding, and quietly wondering why you suddenly felt 2 inches tall. Because while others raised their voices, Queen Elizabeth. The Queen Mother simply raised her standards and watched the unworthy remove themselves. And that concludes the list of the 25 most vulgar, sharp-tongued, and rude female royals in British history. Not vulgar in the sense of profanity, though some certainly swore, but vulgar in the royal sense. Women who refused to smile politely while being dismissed, who scolded when others would have smiled, who held court not with decorum but with domination. They didn't all reign, but they ruled,